Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. Brought to you without commercial interruption by nobody. Chapter 4. The house had a completely different feel to it when Tracy came in from school. It had been numb before, but now it felt more alive. She could hear some violin-y background music. There were lights on all over the first floor. She tried to identify the unfamiliar smell. Cinnamon? Cloves? Tracy investigated the oven. It felt warm, but there was no other evidence that someone had put it to good use. She opened the refrigerator to see if the changes had penetrated that far, shaking off her jacket and scarf as she peered in. Food. Her grandmother must have been to the store. Cheese, 2 kinds. Eggs. She yanked open the fruit drawer. Oranges. Apples. A grapefruit. More peanut butter on the first shelf. An interesting-looking pasta salad. And some sliced roast beef. Tracy speculated. What did her grandmother mean to fix for supper? What was meant to munch on? She sliced silky yellow cheese onto a floured Corelle plate and nicked off a corner of the roast beef. Hefting the plate onto her books, balancing a glass of milk, she pushed the swinging door into the dining room with her shoulder on the way into the room. You've got to do something about this mess, she nagged herself as she dumped her jacket onto the pile of clothes onto the bed. Later. Now for the apprenticeship of Abraham Lincoln. The slight tingle of anticipation between her shoulder blades brought Tracy up short. I didn't know how much I was into this, she thought. She turned quickly to the pictures, hoping for a new view of Mary Lincoln. A picture of a double log cabin caught Tracy's eye. She shivered at the notion of Thomas and Sarah Lincoln spending an Illinois winter in that goose nest prairie log hut. It really wasn't much bigger than a goose's nest, Tracy realised, and probably not as warm. No nice cuddly down. Each of the 2 little cabins scrunched together with a chimney between had a framed-in door. Tracy stretched out her arms as if she was measuring and decided that each side was about as big as an old-fashioned one-car garage. The caption said that this kind of cabin indicated the residents were poor. No kidding, Tracy giggled to herself. I'd have called that set up the lap of luxury if you hadn't set me straight. She shook her head at the information that Lincoln's stepbrother lived in one half of the double cabin with his wife and 8 kids. 10 people. On the next page, Tracy found a variation on the usual Mary Lincoln likenesses. Mary Todd Lincoln's earliest known portrait. Tracy searched the young face, the Cupid's bow mouth, the intense stare, the strong chin, the stiff posture. Picking up the book, she went to the window to get a better look. Maybe to find some softness, Tracy admitted to herself. But she couldn't tease any sweetness out of that face. All the energy seemed utilised to hold everything inside. Mary Lincoln was not giving anything away, not herself or anything she had. Tracy looked from Mary Lincoln to the picture of her mother on the dresser. Finally she pulled her legs out from underneath herself and carried the book over so she could prop it right up against the silver frame. She couldn't say that her mother and Mary Lincoln looked alike, yet she imagined that she detected a similar intensity in both faces. A wintry look, closed in, wary. Neither was merry, certainly. She was looking at grave lines in grave faces. Tracy made up her mind that that was enough of the Lincolns for tonight. Tomorrow would be soon enough for more investigation. Now for some homework. She talked to Mrs. Embry about the pictures at their next session. Look, she instructed her counsellor. Look at that face. It says Mary Lincoln was pretty and popular, had loads of beaux and a wry sense of humour. Do you see any of that in her face? Mrs. Embry held the picture to the light, as Tracy had done the night before. Maybe people had a different idea of pretty then, she said finally. Do you think she looks like a witty, self-possessed belle? Tracy insisted. Mrs. Embry rolled her eyes. Maybe she was a belle when she was young. She's young here, Tracy snapped, hardly aware how sharp a tone she was taking. Well, kind of young. She was born in 1818, so that makes her 28 in this picture. Mrs. Embry admitted she was puzzled. She could see how a belle could mature into a severe dowager. But so early? So thoroughly? She must have had it hard, she concluded. In lots of ways, Tracy agreed. She lost her mother. She didn't get on with her stepmother. She was spoiled by her grandmother. All that's pretty bad. Mrs. Embry twisted her chair to look searchingly at Tracy. I'm impressed, she said. With what I found out? With your pursuit of Miss Mary Lincoln, Mrs. Embry answered. You've really taken hold. You've made this poor woman to come to life for me. For me too, Tracy said. I'm really into her. Did I tell you... Tracy's voice trailed off uncertainly. Tell me... I don't know what you will think of this. Nothing if you don't want me to, Mrs. Embry settled back in the chair, as if this were a casual conversation, and Tracy wasn't moving into an area that could be life or death for her. Tracy fiddled with the books in her lap. At this precise moment she was absorbed by only one subject. She was surprised to see her biology text, her math notebook. Her mind was like a movie screen with only one heroine showing. Mary Lincoln, her life and times, played over and over. This is so silly, I suppose. Last night I propped up my mother's picture next to Mary Lincoln's. Yes. I hope my mother does better than Mary Lincoln. Mrs. Embry chose her words so carefully they might have been diamonds for a wedding band. Have you learned the end of the Mary Lincoln story? I'm afraid of it, Tracy admitted. Afraid of what I'll find. Does that mean you're going to stop looking? Oh no, I wouldn't do that. Mrs. Embry nodded at the Wives of the Presidents on Tracy's lap. Tell me what you found out from that one. Is that the book your mother had? Yes, I'm amazed at how much is packed into just a few pages. Some of it struck me as funny. You know, I told Alan the other night that he's something like Abraham Lincoln. Alan Dencourt? Are you surprised? I see similarities. Tall, long arms, strong. What cinched it was Alan's funny stories. Droll stories with a point. Like Abraham Lincoln's. For example, one of Lincoln's... Listen to this. Tracy opened to her marker. A packet of matches from Chin's. You understand Lincoln was poor, a nobody when Mary Todd married him. But he wasn't put down by her social status. He told everyone that 1D was enough for God, but not enough for the Todds. Isn't that pretty funny? When I think of everything you told me, Tracy, I marvel that he could keep a sense of humour. I know, Tracy nodded. He said that if he didn't laugh, he would have to weep. He kept joke books in his desk and consulted them when life got too tough. Isn't that strange? Kind of, Mrs. Embry conceded. Though I've heard there was a White House person in charge of telling President Reagan a new joke every morning. Tracy didn't smile, as if she hadn't heard. She was poring over her book again. One thing I have to say for Mary Todd. She knew what she wanted and she worked to get it. Listen to this. He is to be President of the United States one day. If I had not thought so, I would not have married him, for you can see he is not pretty. But look at him. Doesn't he look as if he would make a magnificent president? Tracy shook her head. A backwoods lawyer. Someone who carried the mail around in his hat. I don't mean to keep bringing up the Reagans, Mrs. Embry half apologised. They say that Nancy Reagan saw a president in a B-movie actor and pushed him into the White House. Did she really? Tracy was momentarily deflected from her pursuit of Mary Lincoln. How do women do that? When I told Alan he was like Lincoln, I was kidding. I can't imagine pushing anyone in our class into the White House. I guess I'm not as smart as Mary Todd or Nancy Reagan. Or as ambitious, Mrs. Embry added. Part of getting to be a president's wife is giving over your own life to that goal. Tracy felt sorrier than ever for Mary Todd Lincoln. She suffered for it. She was looked up to in Springfield, but she was looked down on in Washington. She got sick with headaches when she was young. She was devastated by them in Washington. She cried and cried. She had violent rages. Her moods went up and down. She had an awful time. How'd President Lincoln treat her? Mrs. Embry asked. Great. Tracy flipped another couple of pages. Here's what he said when she was spending all that money in the White House to impress the locals. My wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I, the poor nobody then, fell in love with her. And what is more, I have never fallen out. Isn't that nice? Mrs. Embry was reading over Tracy's shoulder. Almost too good to be true. What did he think of all those shopping trips for silk and laces and fancy ball gowns they couldn't afford? Tracy had wondered about that herself. He must have felt torn between Mary Lincoln's frivolity and the terrible demands of the war. Partly, he didn't know how much she spent. At one point she was worried that if he wasn't re-elected they wouldn't be able to pay the bills she was running up. Partly, he really grieved for her. He was incredible. "I can't wait for the next instalment," Mrs. Embry said, walking to the door with Tracy. She waved to Alan as he fell in step with Tracy. "Thought I'd find you here," he greeted Tracy. "You're spending a lot of time in these parts. Are you comparing notes on the first spring bird walk?" "No." Tracy slowed her steps. Alan hesitated, restlessly shifting from one foot to the other, hoisting his books to his shoulder. "I've been looking for you. Wanted to ask you something." "Yeah?" "I wanted to ask you about..." "Oh, Alan, I don't have any answers. I wanted to ask you if you'll..." Tracy felt as if she were exploding, as if little pieces of her were shooting out in all directions. She'd been pushing her concerns about her mother into a secret compartment which had suddenly snapped open. She'd hidden her mother under Mary Lincoln. But it was all a fraud, a fake. Something was tearing at her insides, rattling her, scratching at her thin composure, making her head churr. Now Alan was saying, "You'll," as if there was a future. "You'll what? I'll what?" "I won't do anything," Tracy blurted out. "Nothing, anything. Hear me? Nothing at all." Alan blanched. His already angular clumsiness crumpled into disarray, as if she'd unlinked the cotter pins that held them together. Tracy was immediately sorry. She'd been thinking of herself, not him. He didn't even know about her mother. Maybe she should explain. It was too late. He was gone. She pulled her books tight and tried to think about Mary Lincoln, but it didn't work. She couldn't bear to think about anyone's troubles. Not Alan's, not Mary Lincoln's, not her mother's, not even her own. She made her mind a blank. Until next time, good night.